Have you ever noticed that some people never seem to get pressured? They don't raise their voice. They don't try to dominate the room. They aren't the loudest or the most confident. Yet manipulators seem to give up on them surprisingly quickly. Why? Because manipulation doesn't depend on weakness. It depends on predictability. The moment someone can predict how you'll react, whether it's guilt, urgency, fear, or the need to explain, they've already gained influence. But a small group of people quietly break that pattern, not because they're stronger, because they respond differently. And once you understand how they think, you'll start noticing why certain psychological tactics suddenly stop working. The first habit is so subtle that most people completely miss it. 1. They refuse to be rushed. Imagine someone asks you a difficult question. Why did you do that? Or maybe they send a message demanding an answer right now. What happens next? Most people react immediately. They defend themselves, they apologize, they explain, not because they've made a decision, but because the pressure itself demands a response. That's exactly what manipulation feeds on. Urgency. When people feel rushed, they stop thinking clearly. They become easier to guide, easier to guilt, easier to convince. But people who are difficult to manipulate interrupt that entire process with something incredibly simple. They pause, not to think of the perfect answer, but to remove the pressure from the moment. That pause feels uncomfortable at first. Silence often does. But silence forces the conversation back onto equal ground. Without urgency, pressure loses much of its power, and manipulators know it, which is why they often become impatient when someone refuses to react on cue. But that's only the beginning. The next habit is even harder for most people to practice. 2. They don't feel the need to defend every decision. Picture someone asking, "Why didn't you come?" Most people immediately start collecting evidence. Traffic, work, family, timing, every detail becomes part of a case they're trying to win. It feels reasonable. It even feels polite. But something strange happens when we over-explain. We quietly hand the other person permission to judge whether our reason is good enough. In other words, our boundary becomes negotiable. People who are difficult to manipulate rarely fall into this trap. Their answers are simple. I couldn't make it. That doesn't work for me. No, thank you. No long speech, no courtroom defense, not because they're rude, because they understand something most people never realize. A boundary isn't stronger because it's explained better. Sometimes it's stronger because it isn't argued at all. And when someone realizes they can't negotiate your decision, they often stop trying. But there is one tactic that's even more powerful than questioning your choices. It's making you feel responsible for someone else's emotions. 3. They separate guilt from responsibility. Imagine disappointing someone. You see it on their face. Their voice changes. Maybe they go quiet, almost instantly. Many people feel they've done something wrong, even when they haven't. This is where manipulation becomes incredibly subtle. Someone else's emotion begins to feel like your responsibility. But those are not the same thing. People are allowed to feel disappointed, frustrated, even upset. That doesn't automatically mean you've caused harm. People who are difficult to manipulate understand this distinction. They can acknowledge another person's feelings without surrendering their own decision. They listen, they empathize, but they don't confuse empathy with obligation. And once guilt loses its automatic control, one of the oldest psychological pressure tactics begins to fail. Still, there's one final habit that makes all the others possible, and it's probably the hardest one to develop. 4. They don't need everyone to understand them. Most people spend years chasing one feeling, being understood. When someone misunderstands us, we explain, then explain again, then explain even more, not because the decision changed, but because we want approval. Manipulators often recognize this immediately. If they can keep you defending yourself, they keep control of the conversation. But people who are difficult to manipulate accept something uncomfortable. Not everyone will understand them. And that's okay. Because respect doesn't require agreement. Some people will misread you. Some people will disagree. Some people will create their own story no matter what you say. Trying to convince everyone is a battle that never ends. Knowing when to stop explaining often ends the battle entirely. Notice what these people never do. They don't rush. They don't over-defend. They don't accept guilt that doesn't belong to them. And they don't chase approval. None of these habits make someone cold. They simply remove the openings manipulation depends on. Because manipulation doesn't usually begin with force. It begins with a reaction, a rushed answer, an unnecessary explanation, a guilty apology, a desperate attempt to be understood. Remove those reactions, and many manipulation tactics quietly fall apart. The goal isn't to become impossible to influence. Every healthy relationship requires influence. The real goal is learning to recognize when influence turns into control. Because once you can see those moments, you stop responding automatically. And that's often the exact moment manipulation loses its grip. In the next video, we'll look at something even more subtle, the hidden signals people use to control conversations without you noticing. Once you see them, ordinary conversations never feel quite the same again.